Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. It is Monday, March the 8th, 2021. We are working our way through the book of Daniel, and glad to see folks joining on this morning. Get my PowerPoint pulled up here. As always, if you have any questions or comments as we are going through our study today, please use the comment section, and I will deal with those as I see them. But glad to have folks joining on today. And we are ready for Daniel chapter 4. So I want to just, we've been through a weekend, so I want to go through just a couple of things again here. I'll throw some things up on your screen that we've already discussed. Just kind of review them for a second, and then we'll get started on Daniel chapter 4. Hello, Brian, Gail, Diana, and Diana. Two of you. All right. Good to have all of you here today. All right, so we talked about in our introduction the people and times of Daniel. It's so important to understand the dates. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute, but we looked at all the names of the main characters in Daniel, the definitions of those names, the dates of those names, the kings of Judah, Babylon, Persia. We looked at all that stuff in the very beginning when we looked at the names. We looked at both the Hebrew and Chaldean names of Daniel, who became Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So we've considered all of that. One thing I want to touch on this morning, my wife actually asked about me today, is something I remember doing this. I started talking about Daniel's chronology, and I told you the book of Daniel, as we have it, Daniel chapters 1 through 12 in our English Bible, is not in chronological order. So I thought I'd take just a minute to hit on that today. So when you open to Daniel chapter 1, you have Daniel chapters 1 through 4, and we're reading about Nebuchadnezzar. Whether he's dealing with Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the dreams, the first 4 chapters deal with King Nebuchadnezzar. And we know from history that Nebuchadnezzar reigned for about 40 to 42 years. After him came his son by the name of Ebel-Merodach. And we actually read about him in the Old Testament, 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah chapter 52. But in the book of Daniel, we have those first 4 chapters. Let me get something here real quick. All right, so we move from chapters 1 through 4, and again, you look at your English Bible, and you go to chapter 5. But chronologically, we go to chapters 7 and 8 first. Well, how do you know that? How could you say something like that? Well, again, Daniel chapters 1 through 4 cover Nebuchadnezzar. You get to Daniel chapter 5, and we read about Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. But Daniel chapter 5 records Belshazzar's death, the end of his life. But if you flip over real quick to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1, you see the first year of King Belshazzar. And then you look at chapter 8, you read of the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. So chronologically, the book of Daniel is 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, and then at the end of chapter 5, Belshazzar dies, and in chapter 6, we have Darius the Mede arranging the Median Empire in the 120 provinces. So this is the chronology of Daniel. And this is important, because if we don't understand the chronology, it's going to throw some other things off, specifically of things that he prophesies about in chapters 9 through 12. If we don't get this right, we're going to miss some other things. We go from chapter 6 to chapter 11, chronologically. All right? We go, and here's the thing about these Dariuses. There is more than one. Darius is a very common name, and not only do we see that in the Bible here, but we also see it in secular history when you go back and look at Persia and those kings, governors, things like this. So we go from chapter 6 to chapter 11, which is the first year of Darius the Mede, and then you get to chapter 10, it's the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now you remember we talked about Cyrus not only here in the book of Daniel, but also he is prophesied about by Isaiah in Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, about 200 or so years before Cyrus. Isaiah spoke of him specifically. So we go to chapter 10, and then you go to chapter 12, chronologically. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, you pay close attention to the biblical text. There are some things that come out in Daniel chapter 10, specifically talking about Michael the archangel, And that's where chapter 12 starts off. Chapter 12 naturally picks up from chapter 10. And then the last chapter of the book of Daniel, chronologically, is Daniel chapter 9. So we'll deal with all that when we get there, but like I said, I know I mentioned this the other day and I didn't finish discussing it. So there's your chronology of the book of Daniel. We got to chapter 1. We did chapter 2, chapter 3. We talked about the succession of kingdoms from Daniel's dream, or rather from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. We did chapter 3, which dealt with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace. Now we're ready for Daniel chapter 4. So I see quite a few others have joined on. Glad to see everybody. Lyle, Mom, the Owsleys. Good to see all of you guys on here today. All right, let's look at Daniel chapter 4. This is Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, and you read the first 18 verses. And actually, we have the record here of a letter that Nebuchadnezzar wrote, or a decree, we might say, that he wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. Now, that's an interesting statement. I've said a couple of times in this study so far that the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar, they are polytheistic. They believe in many gods. And some, as we looked in chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar made that golden image of himself to be worshipped, some of them felt that they themselves were gods or the descendant of gods. They felt they were some type of deity. Now we get to Daniel chapter 4, and Nebuchadnezzar has had these experiences with Daniel in Daniel chapter 2 in that dream. He had the experience with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3, and he saw them delivered from that fiery furnace. So he's not unfamiliar with the God of the Jews, all right, with Jehovah. So it's interesting to note his statement there, the Most High God, the things that he has worked for me. And it's interesting also because when you look at the prophets, they talk about these foreign nations like Babylon, God using them as his instruments to accomplish his purpose. And that's one of the things we're going to learn here in Daniel chapter 4. But he talks about verse 3 here, how great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. This is God's rule here, what we're talking about. God is the sovereign God. From what I can see here, that's what Nebuchadnezzar's saying. So then he begins talking about his dream. And it troubled him, verse 5, Daniel 4 and verse 5. So once again, he wants all of the wise men of Babylon. We talked about those the other day, the magicians, verse 7, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. They couldn't interpret the dream for me. And so Daniel, you notice verse 8, at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. And there again, you notice the polytheism of Nebuchadnezzar. I named Daniel after my God, Belteshazzar, but he has a God too. Daniel has a God. In him, and I pointed this out the other day, whether you're looking at a King James or a New King James Version, you're going to see this phrase a few times in Daniel. Verse 8, in him, speaking of Daniel, is the Spirit of the Holy God. That's not the correct translation. And in fact, in my New King James here, it's capitalized. Spirit is capitalized and Holy God is capitalized, and that's wrong. This is saying this in him was the Spirit of the holy gods. In his polytheism, this was Nebuchadnezzar's view of Daniel and Daniel's ability to interpret dreams. In fact, he even calls him in verse 9, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians. So that culture, that belief system is still with Nebuchadnezzar. So he talks about this dream. Nebuchadnezzar tells us about this. It's recorded for us, beginning in verse 10, and it goes down through verse 18. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to read all of those verses, but we're going to parallel them. We're going to note the chunk, and then we'll apply it to the later part of the chapter where Daniel interprets this dream. So in verse 10, Nebuchadnezzar says, I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. Okay, so now he has a dream about a tree. If you look over in verse 20, the tree, verse 22, is King Nebuchadnezzar. This tree that he sees in his dream is a dream of himself and something that's going to happen to him. And as you look there in verses 10 through 12 and in verses 20 through 22, where it's recorded where Daniel interprets it for us, it's talking about the fact that God has placed him, Nebuchadnezzar, in this position. And that's how God works. One of the things that we learn here in Daniel chapter 4, the first time it's recorded is in verse 17. The Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. He says that at least 3 times here in Daniel chapter 4. That same thing is true today, by the way. We should never discount the fact, I think a lot of people, they mistakenly, for some reason, connect the idea of, 1 Corinthians 13 talks about miracles coming to an end, the signs ceasing. And I think some people incorrectly make a connection there of, miracles stopped, and so therefore God doesn't do things like we're reading here anymore. I don't believe that for a minute. The Most High, I believe, still rules in the kingdoms of men. God's not in heaven just sitting back and watching things happen, watching things unwind. He is actively involved. I have no doubt about it in my mind. And chapters like this convince me even further of that. So Nebuchadnezzar, again, verses 10 through 12 and 20 through 22 belong together because we learn about this giant tree. It grew strong. Its leaves were lovely. Its fruit abundant. And in it was food for all. Well, that's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon as a world empire. God put him in that position. Then beginning in verse 13, in this same vision of this tree, he says, there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. This is some type of messenger. Most people believe it's an angel who was part of this dream, and that's certainly a plausible explanation because of the way God revealed himself throughout history. It's like Hebrews 1 verses 1 and 2 says, God who at various times and in various ways spoke unto the fathers by the prophets. Well, he communicated through dreams and through angels, and that's what we're seeing here in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The command from that one coming down from heaven was to chop down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beast get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. So if Nebuchadnezzar's the tree, which he is, according to verse 22, he's going to be cut down. And you need to begin reading in verses 23 through 25 to see what that means. Daniel says, as much as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth. And that starts in verse 15. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven. It goes on. This is the interpretation, verse 24, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High. Again, this is God revealing his will, his purposes, in a dream to Nebuchadnezzar, and then that dream is interpreted by Daniel. They shall drive you from men. Your dwelling place shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of the heavens, and 7 times shall pass over you till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he chooses. So what we see happening here with Nebuchadnezzar in this dream is not uncommon with world leaders. Pride, arrogance. He's the source of his kingdom. He's the source of his splendor and wealth and power. And this dream that was given to him tells him, you're going to be cut down. You're going to be brought down. But you notice here in this dream, and I've already read the interpretation that Daniel gave us, but in the dream, going back to verse 15, all right, so the tree's cut down, so there's a stump left behind. The dream was, nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. Well, here's Daniel's interpretation in verses 19 through 27. Ultimately, what's the interpretation? Nebuchadnezzar is going to be cut down. That is, he's going to be humbled by God. But it's only going to last, if you look there in verse 16, it says, till 7 times pass over. And then you look at verse 25, till 7 times shall pass over you. And there's debate. Well, was that 7 days? Was it 7 weeks, months? Most people agree it wouldn't be 7 years. That would be too long to vacate a throne. But whether it was 7 days or 7 weeks or 7 months, Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his arrogance, thinking that he's the source of his kingdom and wealth and power, it's going to be cut down for a long enough period of time to humble him. You notice again here, the end of verse 25, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Then you look at verse 26 here. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you, after you come to know that heaven rules. So again, obviously we know who the dream's referring to, Nebuchadnezzar, and that he's going to be humiliated or humbled by God himself. But his kingdom, his throne is not going to be vacated long enough for someone else to take it over. It's assured that once he comes to himself, as we might say, he's going to come back to his throne, and he's going to have the understanding, verse 26, that heaven rules. It's not Nebuchadnezzar who's in charge here, all right? And I think for God's people today, that should be reassuring. Verse 27, therefore, O king, let my... And I love what happens here with Daniel, because it shows the type of man that Daniel is. Daniel was chosen with his 3 friends to work among the king's court. All right, so he has direct access to Nebuchadnezzar. Here's his advice to Nebuchadnezzar. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. Daniel's petition is, listen, man, you need to repent. Daniel cares for King Nebuchadnezzar, even though Nebuchadnezzar's an occupying force and an aggressive enemy of the Jewish people. Daniel has, over the years, working in the king's court, come to care for him, and he wants him to stop sinning. So there's your dream. There's your interpretation. A big tree. Nebuchadnezzar's the tree. It's going to be cut down. Nebuchadnezzar's going to be humbled, but he'll be allowed to come back to his throne once he has the understanding that heaven rules. Verse 26. Then you get to verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, and at the end of 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? He's lost sight of it again, hasn't he? Heaven rules, verse 26. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, verse 17. It only took him 12 months to forget that. To forget the dream, apparently. To forget the interpretation that Daniel gave. And now he's telling us how great he is and how great his kingdom is and his majesty. While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling place shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you. And again, what that 7 times mean, I don't think we can nail it down dogmatically. Whether it's 7 days, 7 weeks, or 7 months. Again, I don't think it was 7 years. That just doesn't make any sense at all for a throne of a world empire to sit empty for 7 years. So that's not what it was. But for whatever period of time, it's going to happen to you. What verse are we in? Verse 32. Until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. That very hour, the word was fulfilled. And Nebuchadnezzar, as we might say, lost his mind and began acting like an animal. Pretty interesting. But this is all in fulfillment of God's dream, or Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And really, the dream to Nebuchadnezzar was a revelation from God himself. God rules. We need to understand that. Beginning in verse 34, you have Nebuchadnezzar's confession. At the end of the time, at the end of the 7 times, as we're told, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. So that's why I said just a minute ago he was out of his mind. He even says, my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. You remember just back in verse 30, He's bragging about himself and his own power and capability. Now he understands beyond any doubt that it's God. He does, verse 35, according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? Nebuchadnezzar gets it now. A lot of people believe here in verses 34 to 37 that he, the word we might use today is converted. Possible. It's possible. But looking at his past actions, I don't know. Anyway, at the same time my reason returned to me, verse 36, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and my splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles restored to me. I was restored to my kingdom. Remember, the tree stump that was left behind was bound. Well, that's being fulfilled now. All this was restored to him. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. Now he gets it. Now, again, whether he turns away from his polytheism, his belief in many gods and magicians and astrologers and all that stuff we've talked about so far in the first 3 chapters, I can't say that for sure. But it's beyond question that he understood that the God of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that God is above every other God. And he gets it now. That's Daniel chapter 4. Pretty easy to understand. I will throw this in here real quick. So we're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. His son, we read about his son coming into power. If you want to do that, I wrote in the margin of my Bible out here, 2 Kings 25, 27 to 30, and Jeremiah 52, 31 to 34. Again, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for about 40 to 43 years, most people say, and then his son, Evil-Merodach, became king while the Jews were still in captivity. And you read of some of the events that took place in those 2 passages, 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah chapter 52. It's always interesting and valuable, very beneficial, to be able to look at the chronology of biblical events. Not just topics, but, what's the order in which these things happened. So we're going to jump tomorrow. The plan is we'll come back at 11 o'clock tomorrow, and we're going to jump to Daniel chapter 7, because that's the chronology of the book. The first year of Belshazzar. Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. All right. Let me look at the comments here real quick. That's all I've got for myself. I see a bunch of greetings. Glad to see everyone again here today. Appreciate y'all being on here. Diana says, is it that he forgot, or was it that he always wanted power? Just like the Pharisees and Sadducees in Jesus' day on earth. Power and desire of man before God. Well, I guess you're asking in terms of Nebuchadnezzar. Personally, I think he forgot. When you look at maybe forgot's not the right word, okay? But you got to think about it. So he had this dream, and a year passes by. And after that year, it tells us he's walking about the royal palace of Babylon. He's looking at all the stuff that, I guess technically you could say he's built, all right, a royal palace, all of his possessions and things like that. And he's crediting himself with that. But again, while the word was still in the king's mouth, verse 31, I would imagine at that moment in time, he thought, I remember. Of course, then it was too late. But his wording there in verse 30 reminds me very much of, let me turn over here, I think it's in Luke chapter 12. Reminds me very much of what we call that, the rich farmer, the rich fool. Yeah. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. I've got these barns. I'm going to tear them down and build bigger barns and put all my stuff there. He had the same attitude that Nebuchadnezzar had. I'm the source of all my goodness. I'm the source of all my produce and wealth. And in reality, God is. God's in control. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever he will. All right, guys. That is, again, Daniel chapter 4. I appreciate you being on here today. As always, if you have any questions or comments when the stream is over, the comment section is still available. Let's see. Like and share our content. If you have somebody who doesn't do Facebook who would like to do this type of a Bible study, send them over to our YouTube channel. All of this stuff is uploaded daily to our YouTube channel, Mammoth Spring Church of Christ. So thanks for being on here today. Hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we will pick up in Daniel chapter 7. Have a good day.